Okay, when we're talking about instruments and needles, talking about, your gauges, that's basically what we're focused on today. And gauges are something that I've always been really interested in, and it used to tickle me how sometimes on your old Volkswagen Bugs from back in the 60s, the gas gauge had a little cable connected to the tank's engine. The gas tank was in the front. And there's a little cable about that long, that would go from the top of the gas tank. It was totally mechanical. And so it would, basically the gauge had this little cable connected to it. And it was vaguely like one of the cables you would see on your air doors, the old cable operated air doors. It's kind of funny. And that thing, you could move it in and out, and the needle would go click, 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 back and forth. And that was probably one of the more simple gauges. But ever since there's been engines that, running, people have needed to know if what their fuel level was and if it was too hot and that kind of thing. Back in the 1960s and the real early 70s, some of the vehicles, and even now, this is coming back, there's lights on the dash that say cold, which I thought was very interesting, that it would be a blue or a green light, and it would say cold until the engine warmed up to the point to where it needed to be. And so, anyway, all you had was this Boyce Moto meter. It had this alcohol thing in it. It would, right out there it was your radiator cap basically, and it had this indicator in it that would tell you what it is that, your temperature was. And you driving down the road, it's like your hood ornament out there. You could see through it. The hood ornament on a lot of these cars they put out in the 70s, they had like the like the Lincolns and all, and the Mercedes, they call those bomb sight hood ornaments. Well, this thing was kind of like a hood ornament, and it was the Boyce Motometer Company in Long Island, New York, manufactured a variety of different models of these things that varied in size and all. But that's what the thing looked like. Some of you may have seen it if you're an old car buff. All right. Now the old Ford engines, the A models and whatnot, those things did not have a water pump. They percolated the water up, and it would go down through the radiator, and then it would go back in the bottom, and it would just constantly circulate like that. Also, one of the things they did was they put the gas tank right in front of the windshield. It sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? And it would gravity feed into the carburetor. Now, if you ran low on gas when you were going up a hill, your gas, would stop going to the carburetor, and you'd have to turn around and back the car up the hill if you were low on gas, which is all that. And you can take that to another odd way they used to do stuff in the. One of the first vehicles that I drove, and I wasn't driving it legally. I was, in my mid-teens before I had a driver's license. I drove a '55 Chevrolet pickup truck, and that '55 Chevy pickup had vacuum wipers on it. There was a little vacuum motor in there, so you're driving down the road, and if you were holding a nice steady throttle so you had good vacuum, your wipers would go really good. But if you got on it, the wipers would stop wiping just wherever they were. That sounded like a kind of a bad idea. And the vacuum operated hideaway headlights on some of your late 60s Fords and Mercurys. So there was one of those, the 69 LTD that I drove when I was in high school. I paid $950 for it. Anyway, it would the vacuum, the headlight doors defaulted to open. So if you lost vacuum, they would open. And I never looked into the 68, 69 Cougars, but somebody was saying they had one that for some reason or another managed to close the headlights up while they were driving down the road. And so anyway, the long and the short of it is, that's what this was all about. Now, what we got here is we got the Dodge Brothers dashboard, right? These here Dodge Brothers, they had this fancy car that they put the instrument cluster on, and that's kind of what it looked like. It kept up with your mileage. Some of you might remember that back in the day, if you had an instrument cluster speedometer that you had to replace, that speedometer would be have red digits for the 10th digit, and that's the way somebody could just look at it right quick and tell if the speedometer had been replaced. My buddy over at the Ford place popped a new speedometer in one and put the sticker on the door, which is what you're supposed to do, right? How many miles running when you replace the speedometer. And the guy, as soon as he saw those red tenths digit, he drove around to the used car building and he says, how much is it going to cost me to have red tenths digits on my speedometer? And the salesman flat out told him, it's going to cost you probably a fourth of your trade-in value to have that. And I thought that was really interesting. Anyway, the guy came back to the write-up area and said he wanted to know if we could do anything about that. And the guy that put the speedometer in there, he says, no, I'm not doing anything about that. I did my work, I got paid, and I'm through. So I told him that I would take care of it. And what I always like to do is pull the drum out of the old speedometer, because typically there wasn't anything wrong with that. If there was, this bet was off. But I would put that drum that came out of the original speedometer in the new speedometer, and there was no shop manual procedure for doing that. But anyway, I put it in there, and that way the guy would have the same miles with a black tenths digit, and everything would be just like it was supposed to be. Nowadays, if you replace a speedometer, you basically have to go in there and tell them how many miles it is and all this. I've had to replace the speedometer on my pickup because of a battery draw that it started killing the battery. And then the one I bought was killing the battery too, so they ordered me a third one and it didn't kill the battery. But you have to basically fill out some paperwork and tell them how many miles is on the vehicle so they can program that new speedometer to match the miles that are on your truck. Now for years, amp meters measured voltage drop across a resistor. They little shunt in there and it was marked amps, but in the late 70s, voltmeters replaced amp meters on cars, and that confused people because people that were used to looking at an amp meter would say, well, what happened to my amp meter? It's not reading right. Well, they didn't understand the difference between amps and volts and why all of this stuff changed. You see, that was the thing. And so we would have to explain to them, that you're going to be reading like 14 volts or something, or it may have L and H with a line in the middle or something like that. That didn't help either, Bimetal gauges until the late 1970s. General Motors in the early 70s, General Motors on some of their vehicles were already putting magnetic gauges. And the magnetic gauge, when you switch the car off, would stay where it was. Typically, the bimetal gauges would go, would go up, and then well, see what happens is with a bimetal gauge, you've got this little wire wrapped around this bimetal strip, and bimetal's got two pieces of metal get married together that expand at different rates. Okay, all right. And so when you heat that up, it's gonna, because of the way it's hooked to that needle, it's gonna cause that needle to go over. All right. And so this is an instrument voltage regulator right here. That arrow right there is in the wrong place. I didn't fix that. That's the instrument voltage regulator. And believe it or not, that instrument voltage regulator is almost like a flasher, and it basically sends a little gentle pulse out to that, through the gauge to that sending unit. And so whenever you, if you ever hook one of these directly up to power and ground, this will get really hot really fast and all the smoke will go out of it, and then you'll wind up with a gauge that no longer works. So that's why it's really, really important to make sure that you have a good voltage regulator. And what I used to like to do was I used to like to take a test light and put it in there. I'd go to my sending unit and hook the test light to the negative side of the battery with a regular low impedance test light bulb, and then I would put it in that sending unit wire, and I'd see a little pulse. And this was working on Fords primarily. And also, when you were looking at that little pulse, you would see the gauge go up. Now, if you do that on the other one that's got magnetic gauges, the magnetic gauges will have a tendency to just glow real dim, but it will also, drive the needle. And so, anyway, on bimetal gauges, if you ground the sender, that would drive them high, right? Now, the difference is on your, when we got into the magnetic gauges with the two windings in them, on the Ford, if you grounded the temperature sensor or the oil pressure, on the Ford oil pressure sender was not really a true oil pressure sending unit. On the Fords, it would, whenever they went to magnetic gauges, they would just have the oil pressure sending unit short out as soon as it got oil pressure. There was a 22 ohm resistor in line with the, in series with the gauge, and the gauge would go up. That's what that would do. All right. Now, but anyway, the instrument voltage regulator will flash that little light with a test light like I was talking about. Now, high-end cars went digital. They had this fancy stuff. This being, a liquid, there's liquid crystal, and there's this other one here. That's the old timer's disease. Vacuum fluorescent, that's the word I was trying to think of. So guess the year model of this car with this digital cluster. Have you ever seen one like that? That's a pretty snazzy looking cluster, isn't it? That was an 84 Thunderbird. And occasionally I would find one of those that some of the lights would burn out behind the display, and then you couldn't see the liquid crystal display. It would be really faint. So it was a backlit liquid crystal display on these old Thunderbirds. Now, you got to be careful with these old J model Jeeps. One time, and I had worked on a lot of instrument clusters, I had the instrument cluster unbolted from the dash on one of these J models, and whenever I turned the key on, with that thing not bolted down to the dash, and it got its ground through the mount. And when I turned that thing on, it was a real horror story. Every gauge in there, except for the speedometer and the tach, went all the way over to the right, and the smoke went out of them and went all the way back to the left because it wasn't grounded. And that was just, and of course what it mounted to the instrument voltage regulator wasn't grounded, and it was able to just feed voltage to them all the time. And that just really, it burned up all those, these right here got burned up on that. It was one of these old J10s, those 10 mile to the gallon vehicles that Jeep made for a while. All right, now speedometers were really an interesting critter because they basically have this stationary fuel plate. They got this right here mounted so that it's driving that needle against the spring. And this is magnetic. And this shaft is hooked to the speedometer cable, and it spins. And as it spins, it's not actually touching this shell, but its shell is a ferrous metal, and so it tries to follow the faster it turns, and it's against the calibrated spring, and it goes up. I used to see some of those. You can check for accuracy on those with mile markers and a stopwatch, or if you got your GPS that's on your phone or whatever, Be careful about GPS though, because not all GPSs are going to read the same speed. If you got two GPS units in the same car and you look at the speed they're telling you you're traveling, it won't always be the same. That's something you got to recognize. And I like to put it on 60 miles an hour, hold it on 60 miles an hour, and go from mile marker to mile marker on a straight road and see if it takes exactly 60 seconds to get there. You can calibrate one like that. It takes a little bit to do it, but you can do it. You can't always depend on the scan tool either if there's some other kind of an issue at work. You're basically wanting to know, you can look at the scan tool reading and see if it agrees with the needle and that kind of stuff. But I had this Tempo I worked on one time that was, the girl said it was noisy driving down the road. This was a brand spanking new car. And when I drove it up to 4-lane, headed up for the town up the road, when I needed to take a long straight test drive at a fairly high speed, I noticed I had my speedometer setting on like 60 miles an hour, and I was passing cars like a dog on a doormat. And when I wound up checking the speedometer for accuracy on that Tempo, whenever it was going 60, that car was actually going 85 miles an hour. And how she didn't get a ticket or crash or something, be amazing. Maybe she was trusting that speedometer. Anyway, when I used to tear these apart, and this is my hands here that you're looking at, and there's that little needle's connected to this. You pop that needle off of there. You got to know how to do that just right and all. But this little thing right here is sitting down in that. Wait a minute. Sitting down in there. See that little thing sitting in there? I would put we would have speedometers that the needle would all of a sudden make noise and bounce on some of these Tauruses and Windstars. And I found out if I could pull that apart and put one little drop of motor oil in there, and it was a kind of an angle where it would stay so that the tip of that needle was swimming in that motor oil. That's the reason I was taking this one apart. And his knothead from across the shop came over and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm fixing this speedometer here." And he says, "Tell me how to do that where I can take mine apart." And I said, "Why do you want to do that?" This guy was wanting to roll the miles back on his car, That's actually a federal crime for a vehicle to leave the shop with less miles on it than it came in with. That's like letting it leave the shop with, if the tire pressure monitor system is not working when it leaves the shop, but it was working when it came in, you're in breach of federal law. Anyway, that needle shaft right there was riding down in that thing, and there's your little drum, there's your magnet, there's your cable connection. Now, cable-driven speedometers are pretty much a thing of the past now. We used to pull the speedometers out when the needle was bouncing around some, pull the speedometer, that cable out of there and put grease all over it and work it back down in there. A lot of times that would fix any kind of a noise and wiggling they had. Magnetic gauges had these two windings in here that are laid in there at 90 degrees to one another. And you know, coming through the ignition switch, you got this, the more ground that's provided through this, the more the needle is going to go, you know, toward the hot side if it's a temperature gauge or whatever. And so that's pretty much the way that works. The coils in a magnetic gauge act on the gauge pointer, you know, because it aligns with those lines of magnetic force. So if you ground this on a temperature gauge or an oil pressure gauge, it all go all the way. Except on the Fords that have the 22 ohm resistor wired in series, if you ground one of those, it's going to go to the middle. It's just the way that is. They started that in 1987, by the way. Initially, they put the plain old transducer on there, and it didn't work worth a flip. They were giving trouble. So they had us to take a little 22 ohm resistor and put it, it was in a rubberized thing, we put it in between the sending unit and the wire harness and put a different sender on there that would just short out. See, the ones that turns on your light shorts out when you don't have pressure. The ones that are driving a gauge shorts out when you do. And they look just alike, and you can swap them out. So if you put the wrong one in there, you're going to have some issues. All right. Now, modern day clusters are got a computer built into the cluster, you know, and they got all these signals coming in, and your DLC is actually hooked into the cluster. You can manipulate things with your DLC or look for codes in there and all that kind of thing. There are front and rear electronic modules on some vehicles, like on this 2000 Windstar. There was a rear electronic module, and every light on the back of the vehicle went through that thing, and the gas gauge came through that front electronic module to go to the cluster. And if the fuel tank sending unit failed on one of these, the gauge would just stop wherever it got its last good reading, and it would confuse the crud out of the customer. They'd run out of gas and everything else. That doesn't happen a lot, but that was a sort of a bad idea to run that through here and let it network it to the front. I don't know what the deal was on that. This 2007 Cadillac Escalade cluster has gauges that receive their input from the network. Every needle is driven by the instrument cluster CPU. The PCM receives the sensor inputs and sends commands. So the sensor inputs go into the engine control module, and it goes through data communication to all of these gauges. So every gauge is being driven by this computer that's talking to that computer. That's pretty much the way that works. All right. Network-driven clusters are old, though. This is a 97 Jeep Grand Cherokee with a network-driven cluster. And a cluster. That's just the way those work. Now, on the 97 Grand Cherokee, notice the network connection. See that? You got a twisted pair going up there. All these modules hooked together. That vehicle is 23 years old, and it's got this network-driven cluster on it. Not to mention the other network stuff. Here's a 2004 Buick Regal. Now, this is going to be a real complicated wiring schematic, so watch what happens. Look at that. The PCM is talking to that. Pretty much works the same way the other one did, but there's just not a whole lot to that. And if you know anything about networking, you can usually figure out. Now, the sensing, you still got a dedicated sensor. The engine controller, in some cases, will use the one that it uses for its fuel injection and fuel controls, and it will interpolate that and send it in there. Now, there's various different ways. You got to make sure you look at your schematic and see how they're wired up, because it's not the same from one to another. And of course, you can compare your scan tool readings to what you're getting and all that kind of thing. Hybrid electric clusters, are the ones that have a needle. They call them that, and they do a sweep like that. Most of the vehicles you're going to work on now, when you turn it on, the needles do a sweep like that as soon as you crank it up, and that's just sort of like when it would light up all of the segments on a liquid crystal display to make sure none of them are burned out. That way you know if you can trust them or not. Then some of them sweep when it's turned on. Some of them only sweep when you tell them with a scan tool or a button command. On these mid-2000s Chevys that have bad gauges on them and all, what's really cool about those suckers is you can go on Amazon and you can buy a kit that's got all the little servo motors that drive the needles, and it's got lights, it's got a soldering iron and some solder that comes with it. It's got a little tool for popping the needles off and all that, and you can actually look on YouTube and see videos on how to fix those clusters. You can send them off, they'll fix them for you, but you can tear that thing down. It ain't that hard to do. Pull up a YouTube video, get a $35 box of parts that you buy off Amazon, and lay that thing out on the bench on a cloth. Be really careful. You got to have a little bit of a soldering iron experience, so just be careful with that. But anyway, watch out for bulletins. And I had this guy was working at a Chevrolet dealership one time, and he said that they brought him a truck in there that the gauges didn't work on it. He checked all the fuses and didn't see anything, and then he went to the TSBs, and they said you needed to reprogram the engine controller or something to stop those gauges from acting up. And of course somebody else had said you could pull up one of the fuses and put it back in, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, he fixed that one by reprogramming it, and the service manager says everybody I have given one of those to except for you has replaced the cluster and still had the same problem. But he was looking at technical service bulletins because that's what I told him to do, you know. On this one here, this is a lot of verbiage. I'm not going to tell you about all that. But if you've got a needle that's all the way around the other side and you want to fix it, this basically, you can freeze that screen and read it if you want to take the time to do it. That'll tell you how to straighten that out on one of those older ones, and it'll work on probably several different ones too. Illumination, all those little bulbs are pretty cool. You know, the kit I was talking about getting for the Chevrolet comes with brand new bulbs throughout. You put those in there too. Those are fun to do, actually. If you've ever done one, you'll enjoy doing the rest of them. But early on, instruments were illuminated, and we know the cluster illumination could be dimmed. You do it up and down with a little rheostat there, you know, and you got them all. It's a series parallel circuit, and they basically you would go through your headlight switch, and then through this little, and they'd have a separate, the fuse for the interior lights on a lot of them also was off the side of the tail lights that went to the bulbs in the back. So if the tail light fuse blew, it would also kill your instrument lights. So that way you'd know you had a problem. Otherwise you might not know your tail lights were on, unless you had a bulb checker. Now this is the middleman. This right here, believe it or not, this was a 2003 Jeep Cherokee. I put this schematic together for a Motor Age article that I wrote, and in order to gather this piece of information about how that, because I had a dark cluster on this thing, it didn't work, and I went into the schematic. I had to go through 7 pages in the Chrysler Jeep wire, 8W section of the wire to pull this information together, and then I cobble these components in here. And this is basically the Cliff Notes version of how that circuit's wired. If you go flipping through those things on the old OEM shop manual on this 03 Wrangler, it was actually a Wrangler, you're going to find out that you got to flip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now heat that. You know, there was a time when in the early 60s when these Chevrolets had every bit of the wiring on one page, where you could just look at the whole thing, tracing little lines with your fingers and all. But this particular one right here, there was an electronic element to this circuit that fed power to those bulbs. And whenever that goes dark, then the cluster won't light up. And if you're going to fix it back like it was when it was a new vehicle, you got to spend $600 to buy another cluster. Well, on this particular one, I basically just bypassed the circuit, so he couldn't dim those things, but he always had them on. That was, if I was my vehicle, I wouldn't pay $600 for an instrument cluster. One day, this girl had a Mustang that was like an 06 model or something, and she came in walking into the shop over at college. She says, one of my segments of my stoplight won't go off, and I'm afraid it's going to kill the battery. And I said, well, let's go out here and have a look at it. And sure enough, it was on bright as day, and all the other lights were off. And I said, well, let me look and see how that's wired up and what's going on there. Well, that was one of those, it didn't have the sequentially blinking turn signals, but it was wired up so that it could have, if they decided to put it on there. And each one of those segments went all the way to the body control module, or the GEM module, whatever you want to call it on that Ford. And so I basically took the bulb out of the one that was on all the time, and I says, there you go, you're good. Now you don't have that light on all the time, you don't have to worry about killing your battery. She said, well, what would it cost to fix it? And I did some research, and it was going to be like $400 to buy a body control module and to reflash it. And she said, well, I guess I'll have to start saving money for that. I said, if that one light is worth $400 to you, there's other ways to fix that. But I'll be doggone if I spend $400 on a module just to get one light to work. I mean, as much as I like for all my lights to work, that kind of $400, $600, whatever it was a lot of money. All right. The 98 Explorer looked like a road map of Clarksburg. You've seen those things. And this particular little dimmer it actually had two outputs. And one of those outputs would go dark. And you'd have part of the dash that would be dark and the other part would be lit up. And this darn thing would be what was wrong with it. I saw that a bunch of times when I was at the Ford place. It cost about $110 for that back in the day. I don't know how much it would be now if you can even get it. But one of the things I thought was interesting with this field effect transistor that General Motors used on some of their Camaros and Firebirds to operate those lights. This little thing was on a heat sink because it would get hot, and there's a little, there it is in the schematic, and that little sucker would burn out. It's aggravating to get to. You got to put it, above the knee bolster and all that, in a funky, hard place to get to. But those like to die and kill your dash lights, One size doesn't fit all. That's the point. You got to make sure that you understand what kind of system you've got. You got to go to the description and operations section of your manual so that you can tell what module talks to what module and does what, or you'll get in some hot water. That's about all I got for you today. And I'm maybe cobbling together a test to put on the end of this video. I'm not going to commit to that right now. I'm making this on Saturday and I have it released on Monday. And so if I have time today, I'll cobble together a test. But I'm working on another PowerPoint that somebody's paying me to build. And so I may not have time to do that. If there's a test after this, then enjoy it. If there's not a test, then I really appreciate you watching. And that will finish us up for today. And we'll talk to you later.